Thanks for tuning in to another installment of Advanced TV Herstory, a podcast that analyzes shows and celebrates women of television. Thousands of comedies, variety shows, and dramas have aired, yet the presence of strong women, both in front of and behind the camera, is often a story untold. Well, Advanced TV Herstory begs to differ. There's so much more, and it's worth telling and retelling. Sometimes shows offer great leadership lessons, or are so timeless in their writing that people say the series has aged well. We'll explore those shows further. We'll revisit moments in TV where women broke records, exceeded expectations, or put their careers on the line. Advanced TV Herstory will connect the treasures of the past to the great potential of today's TV and online platforms, and how it all plays a part in being a woman in America today. Tomorrow's success is rooted in understanding what has come before us. So gear up for a little storytelling and fun, sociology, fashion, economics, or strategy. It's all here in Advanced TV Herstory. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. Hey all, you know the parameters, women and TV. And man, what fun we've had hitting the pause button on a myriad of moments in TV herstory. Knowledge is power, and today we're going to look at a few revolutionary years in media, precisely that confluence of music and television, and a few of the incredible women who wielded influence and made a difference. On August 1st, 1981, get it? 1981. Remember that when Bar Trivia asks the question? Music television, or as we know it, MTV, launched via cable TV into fewer than 500,000 homes nationwide. Today, actually, it's in something like 92 million, so that's pretty profound. This podcast introduces you to a few of those influential women who worked behind the scenes, working for MTV, the actual channel, the record labels, and some of the independent freelancers assigned to projects. We'll also touch on a few of the less attractive sides of MTV and its evolution that was so necessary to appeal to the changing youth demographic, and those issues are sexism and racism. Regular listeners know that this podcast, Advanced TV Herstory, prides itself on solid research that is supported with first-hand accounts, found preserved for all of eternity on the internet. Sadly, there's really no audio or video of candid reflection or commentary on their days at MTV by any of the women we'll be discussing. The caveat on that is that, yes, Nina Blackwood and Martha Quinn and other VJs have done interviews, but in terms of really candid reflections, they have been pretty tight-lipped. So instead, this segment relies on an incredible doorstop of a handbook entitled I Want My MTV, The Uncensored Story of the Music Video Revolution. And it's written by Craig Marks and Rob Tannenbaum, published by Dutton Publishing in 2011. The authors should take huge credit for archiving history recorded through dozens of interviews with industry and network executives, crew members, VJs, performers, directors, and producers. It is comprehensive, and it's one I recommend enthusiastically. They did a great job of pulling together candid recollections of key events. They cover the business side of the emerging cable TV industry and who the pioneer technicians were who gave us the first big videos, and how women proved themselves as producers, directors, and promoters. You learn a lot reading this book, and it's a pretty fun walk through a period of recent history. Now for some background. MTV's original format, 24 hours a day on cable TV, featured 5 video jockeys. That is the television equivalent of a disc jockey, who would read copy between music videos. The first VJs were Nina Blackwood, J.J. Jackson, Alan Hunter, Mark Goodman, and Martha Quinn. But nobody had ever been a VJ before. A few of these 5 had musical or radio experience, and that was preparation enough for a fledgling cable channel. Once it went to full-day programming, MTV needed to fill 24 hours of programming a day. That's a lot of videos. And the premise was still new enough that the industry, the record industry, those executives weren't totally sold on the on the value that bankrolling this expensive form of promotion would bring, or at least they weren't sold on doing it for just any band. And not just any band wanted to do a video. That was putting people who previously had just been known for their music all of a sudden into a very different spotlight. And then there were artists who did want to do a video, but MTV didn't want to air them. So as it developed, executives set policies that, unlike commercial radio, now think about this, MTV would not pay to air videos. The videos would be the sole responsibility of the record label and artists. And if you knew how to make videos on the cheap, your band had a better shot of landing on MTV in the early days. In fact, that's one of the two reasons why MTV literally made the careers of so many acts. Someone on an act's team had the presence of mind to say, hey, let's do a video, and then they actually did it. And then they shopped it to MTV. And the second reason is this. Before MTV, the music industry's concentration was in New York and LA, and it left little role for the general consumer. Radio networks were the distribution arm of the decisions made on the East and West coasts. We were all just spoon-fed music. But think of the infrastructure of cable TV like you do the interstate highway system. A highway in a rural or suburban setting is far more essential to that area's daily life and economy than it is in the urban core. So with concentrated living comes more options for getting around, or more options for hearing music. In the Midwest, teens didn't have nearly as many radio options, and cable operators were landing contracts to bring the amenity to cities and towns through these sprawling states where it really genuinely helped complete the quality of life. It was far easier to install cable into new or recently built suburbs than it would have been to get it into a 90-year-old brownstone or a stucco single-family home that was built in a fairly dense part of an urban environment. It was just cheaper to do it out in the Midwest, and so that's where cable started. So sports, news, movies, everything we find on cable today, everything that has made us connected as a nation, was brought to us via cable, and it succeeded. But how did cable and MTV make the careers of these performers? Well, think about it, and think about how it is that we use freeways and highways today. These Midwest markets were hungry for more music and had money to pay for it. So if it was fresh and fun and MTV put it on the air, well, those viewers in Dubuque or Denver liked the sound and they bought the tape or the CD, or they wanted it played at their local bar where they were dancing on Friday and Saturday nights. It was really that simple. So video took the power away from the suits who governed radio programming. It was a heady time for this upstart channel, or as the catchy theme song that initiated the entire launch of MTV was, video killed the radio star. At least for a period of time, that could have been said to be true. The women behind the scenes held power and used their voices, and that's what really this podcast is about. Some put up with sexism and harassment, hoping for a better day. Some stood their ground against racist practices. And the last point you should know is that once the channel took off, it had to grow up. So in a rapidly changing industry, on the cusp of a generational change, which is to understand that the baby boom was graduating from college in the mid-80s, and Gen X was a different beast altogether, the channel, MTV, was sold to Viacom. That has its own corporate implications. And there was still rampant drug use and partying artists and crews, but production costs and expectations had now raised the stakes of the game, and the maturity that came along with music television success also would cause it to change drastically. So here are some of the women featured in Marks and Tannenbaum's book. I'm just going to kind of review them with regard to the early stages of MTV and then how it is that they ended up having an impact on either the racism or the sexism that sort of became hallmark. Carolyn Baker was an early MTV executive. She had come on board before all the funding had been found to actually launch the channel. The premise of MTV emerged from a show developed by Monkey Mike Nesmith. He was the tall one who wore the hat all the time. And that show was called Pop Clips. And it was simply a show, half-hour long, hosted by comedians who showed music videos. The entrepreneurial MTV team wanted to do that times ultimately 48 to get you to 24 hours a day. So Carolyn Baker and Sue Steinberg, who was another influential woman of those early days, were 2 of the 5 who developed the prototype and worked out the logistics of how to execute the plan, all assuming it would get funding. Pop Clips was one of a few attempts to bring music video to TV. Each of these attempts had generated just enough success to keep that MTV cohort so focused on the prize of developing a full channel. And that MTV cohort was smart because they plucked sometimes the best talent from these shows, like a woman named Beth Brode, who is an MTV founding producer and had produced a syndicated video clips show called Deja Vu. In the Marks and Tannenbaum book, she recalled, quote, "Response to the rudimentary clips we played was unbelievable. Station managers would get calls from viewers saying, 'This is fantastic. We've never seen anything like this.'" She goes on to say, "This was before MTV, but I knew it was going to explode." Brode would later reflect in the book that women were respected as producers because of their attention to detail and diligence to get a project done. But there were really very few directors. Mary Lambert and Paula Greif were 2, and we'll talk about Mary Lambert in a bit. With the idealism that music television can or should play performers who are entertaining to watch as well as to listen to, Carolyn Baker was in the middle of the racism controversy that would dog MTV through its formative years. On page 168 of the book, she's quoted, and you'll find this kind of in the midst of some of the early controversy surrounding the racism, that she was saying to this group, "We've got to play James Brown." And Bob Pittman, one of the other founding executives, said, quote, "The research says our audience thinks rock and roll started with the Beatles." And that's the end of Bob's quote. And then back to Carolyn. "I came through the civil rights movement. I was a member of SNCC. I believe in opening doors. The party line at MTV was that we weren't playing black music because of, quote, the research, but the research was based on ignorance. I told Bob that to his face. We were young, we were cutting edge. We didn't have to be on the cutting edge of racism," end quote. That's Carolyn Baker talking about some of the early conversations about whether or not to play the videos of black performers on MTV. Along that same time, MTV founders Bob Pittman and John Lack were key to bringing Sue Steinberg into the picture. Or as Sue tells it, quote, "John knew I loved music, so he plucked me from Nickelodeon and told me and Bob to work on a music channel. I became the founding executive producer." Sue Steinberg was the one who led the search for the VJs, using established channels of the day, long before the internet. She put ads in Variety magazine, and she put ads in the trade papers, and there was a bit of a national search. Comedians auditioned, and these auditions were unique because they were premised on simulating the evolving role of the VJ. They needed to be able to look into the camera and introduce videos and talk about bands as though they were really familiar with them, and they needed to provide clever connections with the audience to fill time. Sue did her job quite well, and Nina Blackwood was the first VJ to be hired, and then the others came along subsequent. One of those other hires was a woman named Meg Griffin, who was a veteran radio DJ, and she really was an original VJ, but we never saw her. She encountered what would be a narrow, prejudiced side of Bob Pittman, the gentleman who was having the conversation about James Brown, talking about research. And Meg ultimately left MTV, but she said this: "I went in kind of begrudgingly one day to audition for MTV, and it felt good that they wanted to hire me. I was in an office next to Bob Pittman, and I overheard him say, quote, 'I have my black, my Jew, my wasp, my sex bomb, and now my tomboy.' And I was like, what did he just say? It rubbed me the wrong way," Griffin said. The channel hadn't launched yet, and after a few weeks of development work, Meg Griffin just didn't show up for work one day. Martha Quinn was hired to replace Meg. So yes, Martha Quinn, Nina Blackwood, 2 of the most recognizable faces of MTV. And Nina Blackwood had auditioned while her other gig was as a harp player in a hotel. She was a working musician, and she was very adept at transferring rock and roll to the harp. But in fact, really, her earlier credentials came as an acting student of the Lee Strasberg Institute. So these were kind of big, important credentials to become one of the first VJs. And as she says, I was working on 3 different local prototypes for music video programs where I'd do interviews or introduce video clips. I sent in my resume and an 8x10 photo, which I drew on with watercolor pens to make it look punky. Steinberg saw promise in Blackwood, and she flew her to New York for the interview. And even today, you can go to ninablackwood.com, and she's still doing lots of interviews with people in the music industry. She's very accomplished and well known as a promoter of Newark. With Meg Griffin gone, but the qualities of her replacement needing to have to fill in that place, that tomboy place, as defined by Bob Pittman, they interviewed Martha Quinn. And as Martha says, I said, "What's a VJ?" And a couple days later, she was hired and became an original VJ. There was a reason why Nina Blackwood had earned the sex kitten role. She tells this story in the book. In 1978, which was to say probably 2 years prior to all of this MTV developmental work, when I was living in Cleveland, she says, I posed for Playboy. When Playboy got wind of my MTV job, they decided to reprint the photos. I got called into the MTV offices over this. I remember feeling like a scolded little girl, having to go to the principal's office. They weren't real thrilled, which I find pretty ludicrous considering what MTV turned into. So from August 1st, 1981 until 1986, when Blackwood would be the first to be let go, the 5 original VJs were part of the teen and adult worlds, every day for hours at a time. They were trusted faces. They recount that management really didn't want them to become stars, so they were held to restrictive contracts. No outside endorsement or commercial work. No capitalizing personally on their rising fame at the time. That would change with the second wave of VJs that would come along in the latter half of the 1980s, and that second wave would also make considerably more money. But seriously, who remembers the second wave of VJs other than Julie Brown and maybe Kurt Loder? Original VJs Nina and Martha have teamed up with their male colleagues who are still living, Mark Goodman and Alan Hunter, to write a book entitled VJ, The Unplugged Adventures of MTV's First Wave. The channel and music videos as an industry proved to launch careers of women who are still working today. Their accounts reveal the racism or sexism that was part and parcel of a male-dominated industry, which in itself was experiencing a shift in power. Judy McGrath left her job writing for Glamour magazine to write on-air promotions at MTV. So think about how important on-air promotions were at that time. People were just getting cable for the first time. They were getting exposed to all sorts of new channels. And this one had to explain itself and had to make it seem like the hippest new thing to do was to sit on your couch and watch music videos. Because after all, for your whole life, you had the radio, and you could be in the car, or you could be doing something, or you could be playing with the dog in the yard. Music television called for a whole new approach to music, and that is this whole focus on a video in order to enjoy your favorite band. McGrath would go on to become the CEO of MTV, and even today she's involved in cutting-edge branding and social media strategy work, and she advances careers and she showcases talent, and she's in the thick of it. Within the record labels, a new position was created, and that was that of video promotions, director, assistant, whoever. And those positions were frequently filled by women. Or as executive Susan Silverman puts it, quote, the record business was a man's world, but there was an open door for women who had chutzpah. Video was the one area we could take over. And take over they did. Video promoters were in a sense like the sales force, coordinating the band side of production so that everything was in place for the video to appeal to MTV. But it was a man's world at every step. Siobhan Barron, who was an established video producer, told the book's authors the story of being called the C word by Boy George, of Culture Club because she told him that the two directors he wanted for his I'll Tumble For Ya video weren't available. You know, sorry, boy George, I can't get you director A and director B. So he fires back, you are a, It's a rough and tumble world when boy George is calling you names. So, back at MTV, executives came to learn that one of the more proven ways to build their audience numbers and engagement would be to put up contests. To combat the cynicism that most people have, that they, quote, never win anything, Marcy Braffman, a woman who was, again, in the internal MTV promotions department, is credited with developing the concept called People Really Win on MTV. And that is that contest winners, after they won, were followed around for some period of time just to show that they led everyday lives. And remember that these were big contests, not necessarily for physical prizes like cars or dishwashers or stereo systems. They were experiential ones, like a one-night stand with Journey. And it's likely that every dorm floor in America, in the year that Journey contest took place, housed at least one young woman who sent in her entry to win that contest. So that tells us a little bit about sort of the inner workings of MTV and how they went from being a fledgling channel and really grew their audience and grew their visibility and entered into the living rooms of young Americans. But now we're going to move on to this notion of racism and sexism and these two issues and how they were handled behind the scenes. And really, from all sorts of different perspectives, sometimes they were handled well and sometimes they just evolved into the next chapter. So Marks and Tannenbaum's book details, from many first-hand perspectives, the channel's reputation of being racist. The matter came to a very high-profile head when CBS Records battled MTV for the airing of the first Michael Jackson video, Billie Jean. Jackson, even at that time, was an established performer who CBS knew well. He had been an emerging breakout talent that would change America, and yet MTV resisted. Here are some recounts from women. Susan Blond was a record executive at CBS, and she says, quote, "In those days, we usually had a messenger bring a new video to MTV. But in this case, we realized it was special. I brought them this amazing video, the Michael Jackson Billie Jean video, and she said, and they said, basically, quote, this doesn't fit into our network, end quote. I first met Michael when he was a kid, and he was obsessed with the Osmonds. They were getting more coverage than the Jacksons because Michael was black. This had been a major thing with Michael his whole life, and he had been excluded from the media because he was black, end quote. So that's Susan Blond, with her perspective right there at CBS Records of how MTV did not really want to air or help launch Michael Jackson's video career. CBS then threatened to pull all their videos from MTV if Billie Jean didn't get aired, and the rest is history. Michael Jackson had a profound influence on videos. But remember that even back to Carolyn Baker, James Brown didn't fit the research, and executives initially didn't want anything to do with Michael Jackson. This racism and the approaches to cracking it weren't exclusive to MTV. Grammy and Oscar-nominated producer Sharon Oreck recalled, quote, when we cast Glamorous Life, which is the excellent song by Sheila E., Sharon Oreck says, we hired a really handsome black guy to play Sheila E.'s love interest. A short while later, we heard from Simon Fields that Prince's camp, because Prince was Sheila E.'s producer, Prince's camp didn't like him, and we couldn't hire him. Mary Lambert said, why don't they like him? Is he too tall, too short? And finally, Simon said, they don't want a black guy. And we were like, what are you talking about? She's black. We were told they wanted the record to cross over, so there needed to be a white boyfriend. Mary and I were appalled. End quote. So that was Sharon Oreck, and Oreck factors in yet another great story, and we'll talk about Mary Lambert in a minute as well because she's incredibly influential. But let's review, just on this Sheila E. story for a minute, the assumptions and challenges that went into that question of who should play Sheila E.'s boyfriend or love interest in a very memorable video. Although I will say I remember the video more for Sheila E. just being phenomenal than for what the boyfriend looked like or who he was or if there was some social message behind it. Video is art, but it is also promotion. The audience at that time, cable TV audience, is mostly white, living in the Midwest. Prince was a notable game changer and provocateur, and he was guiding Sheila E.'s career. And he's the biggest name in the room, and he happens to be from Minnesota, which is a very white state at the time. And if he thinks that the boyfriend should be white, well, that's his opinion, and that's his call. The two women who have worked closely with female artists over the years thought the boyfriend should be black to match Sheila. I don't know that there was a right or a wrong answer in this, but these were some of the questions and really some of the trajectories of social change that they were working with. I find that incredibly fascinating. Sharon Oreck seemed to be in the tight place frequently. I bet she could write her own book. So she also tells of coordinating the audience for Janet Jackson's Control video. Now, this is the later 80s. The event itself, in order to get an audience for the video production, the event was billed as a free concert, although it was really lip-synced, and it included multiple takes of just that one song, Control. Right before they're beginning to shoot in earnest, they are told by a record company executive on site, quote, and this is quoting Sharon Oreck, more white audience members needed to be closer to the front, end quote. The audience had skewed African Americans since they were the ones who thought that they were attending a free Janet Jackson concert. Oreck and the team had to gingerly ask white people in the audience to move closer to the front, not just once, but 3 times. After the 3rd time, Oreck lost it, and she cried, and then she told the guy from A&M Records that if he wanted more people to move, he'd have to go on stage and ask them himself. Ladies and gentlemen, imagery is a powerful agent of social change, so hold on to that thought. Cable TV gave us the chance to begin tailoring our viewing habits just the way we wanted. Movie channels, news channels, talk show formats, children's programming. And MTV struggled with how to gracefully ease into serving the next generation of young people. The next generation, who could barely remember TV without cable, didn't look or act like its predecessor. The music and messaging were totally different, and because MTV didn't necessarily have its own act figured out, they couldn't effectively collaborate with the record companies to create the next big thing. In fact, the next big thing would come along organically. And it happened, and no one was ready for it. And it had an awful lot to do with more diversity. Rapper Kool Moe Dee credits industry executives Ann Carly and Russell Simmons with pushing MTV to a new audience and next phase through rap and hip-hop. As the rapper says in MTV Book, quote, "We were aware that there was one video budget for R&B or hip-hop acts and another budget for a pop act. We had to fight to even have a video budget in our contract. The record label would tell us we could do one video, and if our single sold 250,000 copies, we could potentially get a second video. But labels didn't believe in spending money on hip-hop videos," end quote. Ann Carly went on to a long and distinguished career, advancing the imagery of all sorts of communities of color via music videos. And in 1999, she earned the Golden Ring Award from the Asian American Arts Foundation. And here is a clip from her acceptance speech, and I hope you find it as powerful as I do with regard to the mindset that she carried through her career to creating opportunities to diversify the musical offerings in America.
I'm shocked. And I was a big fan of Ben Fong Torres. I used to read his articles in Rolling Stone magazine, like a Bible, when I was a kid, wanting to get into the music business. Not really a kid. I want to thank the Asian American Arts Foundation. I think this is a wonderful thing. It is wonderful to be recognized by your community, as some of the other honorees have said before. I've worked a lot in African American pop culture. A lot of my career has been there. I've been recognized there, but to be recognized by an Asian American arts is a fantastic thing for me. It's really, my mother is unbelievably proud. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my mother, who came to this country. She was grew up in the war in Japan, and she came here in her 20s. And she said to me, quite amazingly, I think, for a young woman of her background, she said, "You can do anything you want to. Different doesn't mean bad. It means special. Don't ever forget that. Don't ever let anybody tell you who you are. Only you can know that. Only you can determine that." It's been those words that have led me through my career. That and the words of a lot of rap records. I also want to thank the many artists, whether they're...
She seems like a very cool lady. The channel's focus took a strident shift from art and promotion of cutting-edge music to sheer profit as Viacom bought the network in the later 80s. MTV's reputation for being racist, or at least not a very welcoming environment to black performers, extended into its life beyond the original mid-80s concept. The first rap-based show debuted in 1988. But during that mid-80s transition, where top artists like Sting and U2 and the Pretenders were replaced by racier, more misogynistic videos of hair metal bands, you remember those days? And then after that, reality shows and specialty shows started to line up, and the Spring Break Special Event Series debuted in 1986. This was the culture that was emerging on MTV. And all the while, on cable TV's TBS, there was a show called Night Tracks, and it aired on Friday nights, and it showcased up-and-coming rap performers and their videos. But inside the offices of MTV, the fight about racism and sexism and what sold still continued. And it was about that time then, too, that top artists of the later 80s, like Ann and Nancy Wilson of Heart, were getting a tremendous amount of pressure to steer away from concert-style videos and to become more sex kitten in their approach, in their wardrobe, in even the concert appearances that were filmed for video. Bikinis and pole dancers were doing so well with selling hair bands, why wouldn't it work for these women performers too, right? So these women performers who had one foot in being women on TV, not that they necessarily ever dreamed that when they were taking guitar lessons, this had to be a very hard and confusing time for them. Who made decisions for them? Particularly if they were the front of the band. How much control did they have in saying what they would or wouldn't wear? And who was pressuring them to be what they weren't in order to sell more records or to get their video picked up on MTV? And if they pushed back or refused, did they earn that profound reputation that we know to be apparent in all industries, that she's difficult, she's a diva? And then there were a host of other women performers who were excluded from MTV and the genre of music videos because the target market had now gone right to Mountain Dew drinking young men. It wasn't about art anymore. It was about profit and finding the demographic that would deliver the most. This focus on looks and sex and hair and fashion caused the emergence of fashion photographers to really heavily influence the videography side of production. Videos were now selling performers who otherwise would never have made it on their talent. You need only go back to Milli Vanilli and that whole story to understand that. And occasionally, there were talented performers in the mix who both looked good and sounded good. And then there's Madonna. Okay, so remember I promised to tell you more about Mary Lambert? Mary Lambert is the woman from the story who thought that Sheila E.'s video boyfriend should have been black. And she's been a professional colleague with Madonna since day one. In the book, Mary Lambert revealed, quote, Madonna works with a lot of different stylists and costume designers, but nobody really dresses Madonna except Madonna. The whole trashed-out lingerie street look, where your dark roots and your bra strap are always showing, and there are holes in your stockings, that was all her. End quote, Mary Lambert. Lambert hails from the Rhode Island School of Design and had been working in the special effects side of video production. She showed some of her work on videos of emerging artists to Warner Brothers executives, and she was hired forthwith and assigned to work with a then unknown Madonna. And in her heyday, no one pushed the envelope of standards and decency, with those bra straps and holy stockings, more than Madonna. Now, the woman who would maybe have to navigate the rules that Madonna was both making and breaking was a woman named Michelle Von Feld. She was the head of MTV's Standards and Practices. And she told the book's authors, quote, "We had 4 constituents we were trying to please," end quote. First, she listed the stakeholders as being the cable companies and the FCC regulations that they needed to comply with, the advertising community, which had finally recognized the huge connection MTV made with key demographics, the creative folks who were looking to invoke their own sense of art onto another artist's work in the hopes of achieving a music video success, and think of all the egos involved in that, and finally, the audience at large, which had changed significantly since the first days of MTV, not to mention had also grown as cable itself became much more structurally found throughout the United States. So she says, quote, "We devised a 2 or 3 page document, our standards document. It wasn't a list of words you couldn't say on television. It was more our philosophy." Von Feld explained, "It talked about not glorifying violence. It discussed sexual matters, issues of taste, and things that could be hurtful to other people," end quote. So some were quoted in the Marx and Tannenbaum book as observing that the more popular the artist was, the less that the standards and practices that Von Feld had to enforce applied to his or her video, and Madonna was frequently cited. Okay, so as video production is becoming more expensive and MTV is finding other ways to fill their 24 hours in a day, what little airtime they had left for music videos or were using for music videos was really incorporating hair metal bands. And it weighed heavily on the objectification of women. And this captured the audience that they wanted, and it stroked the egos of young men watching. Was it misogynistic? Yes. Was it within MTV and all those record companies' First Amendment right? Yes. And so when the VJs changed in 1986 and a little bit later, it also demonstrated a recognition of the cultural shifts that were occurring in America, as they subtly wanted to see in their audience, and that by the early 1990s, the music experience had become really customized. So they were not looking to just replace the same models of VJs of there being a sex kitten and a tomboy and all that. The music experience changed, the music industry changed, and the internet only made everything more so. So in that second wave of VJs, we find Julie Brown and Carolyn Heldman. Tabitha Soren, you may recall from that early Rock the Vote, became the face of MTV News, and that covered social issues and provided new generations of viewers with more information about the industry. Downtown Julie Brown is probably the best known of the later arriving VJs. She had come from London. She carried with her an attitude and a style all her own. It was very urban. That's what MTV wanted, but she was not going to be molded by MTV and its rules. But with that ego and edginess, she was known for being difficult to work with, or at least that's how people wanted to peg her. And numerous examples are found in the book. Again, is she difficult to work with, or did she really just know her style and her expectations, and she wasn't willing to settle? That would be a really interesting question. Another VJ, Carolyn Heldman, who had been hired in a national search for the second wave of VJs, had been a real disc jockey in Colorado, and she was the total antithesis of downtown Julie Brown. She was by no means an urban person. She was more of a hippie. She did have big hair, I'll say that, but she came across much more casual and confident. She made the mistake of appearing on camera in shorts and was fired shortly thereafter because her legs just weren't as good as MTV wanted them to be. As a company, MTV was non-guild, so the hiring requirements for crew members, those behind the scenes, were less stringent for their projects. A woman named Beth McCarthy was an assistant director at the tender age of 25. Poorly paid, she gained experience that would give her control on shows like MTV Unplugged, Saturday Night Live, and 30 Rock. So this second wave of VJs and its crew ushered in more original programming that was as much lifestyle-oriented as it was about the music. There was Club MTV, which featured new music and dancing, kind of think an American Bandstand. And then there was their spring break coverage, which began in 1986, and each year outdid itself. It was excess. Here's a Carolyn Heldman clip that includes some MTV spring break banter.
Hi, starting on Friday, this Friday, 2 days away, it's MTV Spring Break '88. It's the blowout. It's Daytona. It's incredible. Squeeze and Richard Marx in concert. Usual craziness from poolside at the Hawaiian Inn. You can imagine all the things that are going to happen. Maybe you can't imagine. Special spring break versions of Remote Control on Friday, the Top 20 Countdown, and Dial MTV. It's 3 whole days of madness. It starts Friday afternoon. Right here, a video that basically sort of set a trend, or maybe it just sort of brought to the forefront a trend that was happening already. George Harrison's Got My Mind Set on You.
Channel promotions guru Marcy Braffman observed of the evolution of all of this original programming, quote, MTV's spring break coverage really bothered me. I mean, wet t-shirt contests? Even with all the rock and roll mayhem at the network, we never had a sexist outlook. Of course, a lot of that had to do with the fact that there had been a lot of women running the network. MTV didn't objectify women back then, end quote. Still, MTV was, at least according to the book, a real microcosm of 80s feminism. Sexism and sexual harassment existed. You just had to decide whether it was your battle to take on. We were still a few years away from Anita Hill's testimony at the Senate confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas. Whether to speak up or remain quiet varied in degree for a woman based on her status, appearance, age, and attitude, and that was no different in the halls of corporate America as it was in the halls of MTV. One of the most candid statements, I'll say, came in the book from a woman named Linda Corradina, who was an MTV executive and who has since gone on to lead all sorts of projects. And she says this, quote, boys are stupid. What can I say? A lot of guys were known for hitting on girls, especially younger girls. There were men, married men, who didn't have boundaries, absolutely. But girls can make their own reality. You put up with it or you don't. If you're intimidated by it, you should report it. I can't say it ever bothered me, end quote. While it held true to its core mission of music television through the airing of videos, MTV posted powerful imagery that changed America. Behind the scenes, a few good women thrived in the thick of things and contributed to sound decision-making. The snippets of insight contained in this Marx and Tannenbaum book reveal that women with visibility and power were scrutinized with a different standard, just as they are today. And the channel's success transformed the recording industry, maybe not in a great way, since it now took on this tremendous emphasis on looks. But then the internet crushed the old business model entirely, and it's far more fractured today. So today, agility, if you're in the recording business and you're in the music business, is essential. Yet women are still outnumbered at the highest levels across the entertainment world. These talented, influential women of MTV have a place in Herstory. I hope they've applied lessons learned or courage gained from their experience to advance the careers of other women. Thanks for listening to this installment of Advanced TV Herstory. For a topic set in the 80s, I have to say we exercised a lot of restraint on the topics of hair and fashion. If you're looking for a book that teaches you as much about business as it does about illegal substances, make I Want My MTV, the uncensored story of the music video revolution, high on your reading list. Audio clips used in this segment both come from YouTube. Someone uploaded a great short clip of Carolyn Heldman pitching spring break coverage, and thanks to the Asian American Arts Foundation, which shared its 1999 Golden Ring Awards video on YouTube, too. Find this and past scripts on my website, CynthiaBemisAbrams.com, where you can also learn how I can bring TV Herstory topics to your conference or leadership training session. We're on Facebook. Just look for Advanced TV Herstory. Please leave comments or ratings on iTunes or Libsyn. Feedback and ideas for future installments are what keeps this podcast fresh. Contact us at advancedtvherstory, all one word, @gmail.com, and share your ideas or a project you're working on that builds a connection. We tweet too, and a follow or a retweet is always appreciated. We are at TV Herstory. Until next time, all I can say is thanks for listening. Thanks for recommending this podcast to your friends and family. Knowledge really is power. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams, saying rock on.